jumping in and kicking off things, I think in order to lead up to our discussion of dark patterns, I thought it made sense for us to just briefly discuss and touch on privacy by design in our respective organizations. And I'd like to maybe start with Sarah from a organizational angle as the lead privacy person inside of a company. How do you approach both privacy by design and your role as kind of product counsel, and how to weave privacy by design into the sort of fiber of the organization?
Absolutely. I mean, we do have the standard training type of core specific things where all new engineers and product people, we have a specific privacy by design training. And then we also have a series of inorganic or organic ways that we do it, which is through quote unquote privacy champions that work in different departments. Also, we have a pretty robust privacy impact assessment process that happens very early on the stage, and in our involvement with these PDE check-ins. And so we're regularly trying to have all members of my team talk with product and engineering about, what are the ideas that are coming to mind, how they are envisioning bringing those products into fruition, and are they considering things such as, is this what a consumer would expect? Would they understand this language? If we're making choices between, making the button blue or making the button gray, how often is that? We're going to test that. Are we going to try and see whether or not that we're being transparent in the choices that we present to people, or that we're actually carrying out the intention of the language of whatever choice might be popping up for either our customers or their end users?
It's a great answer, and it's an interesting to hear your point of view. Alice is a smaller company, 160 people. Your company bigger than that, as it consumes a couple different companies. And Pedro, a bigger company. How do you all think about privacy by design in an org that size? And what does Keanu, your dog, think about that as well?
Well, he's really mad that I didn't introduce him during intros. So that's Keanu, the Hungarian Vizsla. He says hello. It's a good, the privacy by design question is always a good one, right? And like the implementation of privacy into like ordinary system processes and business procedures is increasingly important. And I don't even want to call it like, it's not nice to have, it's necessary. Facebook specifically has spent the last year and a half, 2 years investing tremendously in implementing a robust like privacy operations component to all of its design procedures, right? Most of this information is available online if people want to know the details. But the reality is, in a big company, and this is my third kind of gigantic company, it's hard and it's expensive, and sometimes there's resistance, right? Outside of the privacy space, right? People tend to think adding a layer is going to slow things down, is going to add, approval layers and procedures that, engineering teams tend to resist kind of natively, especially older, well-established engineering teams. We're seeing the tide of that change. I was watching that happen at Salesforce. I watched that happen at Oracle. I'm definitely seeing it here, where not only is there less resistance to the privacy by design component, meaning implementing privacy professionals, lawyers, engineers, et cetera, into the design process. I'm seeing invitation to it, right? Like I literally see engineering teams like not starting workflows until like the privacy component of the cross-functional team is incorporated, which I think is a great sign for the future, right? I think we're watching builders and developers understand that to make products, part of the product success is that it has a privacy by design component to it, that privacy was thought about upfront and built into the greater feature functionality or like production system that's being built. And so I'm seeing great strides at big companies. For me, never, having not been at a small company in a long time, I see some challenges there, right? Because Facebook can make tremendous amounts of investments, right? So could Salesforce, so could Oracle. And we have the staffing and resources to do so. But if you're not an incumbent and you're a company like yours, Andy, that is like rapidly growing, but still in kind of like early stages, making these investments can be really tough decisions. And I can totally relate to the position it puts.
I think one thing that's similar across all three of our companies varying in size, is that you have to set the culture of privacy, and that starts probably with the privacy team itself, obviously the legal or privacy people that are focused on those issues. And in a small company, you may be doing different things in order to do that, to set the culture. Like in my company, we do a bunch of different things to make sure that it's a norm, that privacy is thought of and thought through, and something that's a value that Alice is thinking about and speaking about, and it's part of our like tagline is always be personal. So we have to live that. And we have to live that, and we have to have the backup to back that up. So we start talking through what that means to us culturally. So one of the things that is certainly clear to people that are paying attention, Pedro, is that Facebook is diving into creating a privacy of culture, a culture of privacy, or respect for privacy, or compliance and such, and that's been happening. And so I'd be interested to hear from both of you, like, what do you do culturally to imbue privacy within the organization, at different stages? I mean, it can be something little.
So I'll say this, and I wouldn't have joined Facebook if I didn't believe what you just said, which is that Facebook is very committed to improving the privacy and user control on the platforms. I mean, I have no doubt, and I see it on the inside. And I wouldn't stay here if I didn't think so. And so I guess me and many others that have been hired in the last couple of years are part of that wave of change. So when you talk about culture, hiring a lot of privacy people really helps, Andy. Okay. Again, this goes back to resources, but Facebook has made tremendous amount of investments in people with long track records of being privacy advocates and privacy experts to come in and kind of help cultivate that culture. But there's another thing I'm seeing too, and it's not just unique to Facebook. I see it at our competitors. I see it at companies that are B2B. I'm hearing it all over the place, which is, 5 or 6 years ago, executives, particularly senior executives, C-suite, besides the chief privacy officer, obviously, talked about privacy in the context of risk to the business, right? Like, it was always like data breach remains a risk, these kind of things. You'd listen to quarterly reports, and that would be like a risk factor always mentioned. Now it's almost turned completely around, and like senior executives, CEOs are talking really loudly about the investments being made in their privacy programs to differentiate themselves, to give themselves a competitive advantage, to talk about all of the cool innovation that's happening that's making their products better. And so I think we've moved from 6, 7, 8 years ago, kind of like we need to incorporate privacy to comply with rules that didn't even exist then, but we knew we're on the way, to more of a if we don't build our products with privacy in mind, we're not gonna be able to sell them, and nobody's gonna be interested in them. It's a feature, right? And so I think that transition really helps foster, to your specific question, the combination of senior leadership making investments and being loud about it, and then some of those investments meaning hiring experienced professionals who sort of aren't willing to make compromises that jeopardize. Oh, I think I got muted. I think are both leading to the kind of shift in culture and just kind of like the general chatter out there about privacy.
Sarah, what's your take on this? I'll be interested to hear, because I used to work at an ad tech company. So where there's an ad tech element to what you're doing, I found privacy, to your point, Pedro, I found privacy was a core part of the offering. And that's why we were doing so much work. So I'd be interested to hear from you, Sarah, like what your thought is there too.
Yeah, I agree with Pedro 100% on the fact that privacy needs to be seen, and part of the culture of your company should be seeing it as opportunities to make your product more flexible, to make it, meet the standards of your different customers, and also to try to be a steward of privacy and helping to educate your consumers and end users. We're making this choice in the way that our product functions for these reasons, because, everybody's got a limited amount of bandwidth and time. And so you're deeply entrenched in your particular area and you're learning your area. Not everybody is along in the same stage of the journey. So, one is flipping the script and making it an opportunity and a top of mind that would gives you a competitive differentiation. Also can inure some goodwill in your brand with end users and and your customers, if those are two different things. And as well as, the way that you're getting more people to talk about it regularly, and it's not just sort of at the end of the meeting, oh yeah, how are we going to be compliant? Really starting first, as you mentioned, before you even sign off on your PRDs or get things in the early stage of production. It's like, let's make sure we've had a dialogue and a conversation about this, and that that you're inviting the people in the organization who are the privacy champions to be sitting in through parts, and then they're learning also to bring up those points at all stages of the journey to make it really baked into the ethos of the company.
We've got a related question here that I want to answer, which is from Daniel about what was like the light bulb moment that we've seen that actually sort of flips the switch on getting the culture of privacy like up and running in companies that maybe are new to it. And I don't know if there's like a light bulb moment. I mean, I think it's like, for me, I can only speak for myself, but when I join a company, I'm talking about it right away. When I get an opportunity to speak in front of the whole company, it's like I'm illuminating, this is what's important, and related to what we've talked about, here's why it's important to our business, not just the deflection of risk, or because that really doesn't resonate with people as much. It resonates with us, but it doesn't resonate with a broader swath of the company. What does resonate is, here's how we're taking care of this. Here's how we're thinking about it. Here's how it advantages us. Here's our unfair advantage when we are on top of this, and we're developing products and features that that respect consumers and respect users, and it'll get us through RFPs quicker, and it'll get us through, you can give a lot of tangible results. And so I just start from the beginning by being a bullhorn for it, and being available to answer questions, and creating Slack channels around it, and creating buzz and excitement about it. It's the little things that matter. And I'm sure this is happening both of your companies as well. We have a Slack channel called Privacy Champs. I include people in that. I make them feel like, yes, you are a champion in the business. You're helping us, whether that's a product person or an engineer or a marketer. Like, it touches every aspect of the business. So like, you can have a privacy champion on the people team. And so I think the little things like that, I don't think it's one watershed moment, like it's sort of like, you don't become GDPR compliant one day and then jump up and down and wear your GDPR cap. It's just it doesn't work like that. Compliance is a flowing river, is what I say at Alice. And I created stickers with the Alice bird that say compliance is a flowing river. All those little things you do to imbue privacy into the culture of your business. So, and my take is, it's a series of little things, and it's consistency.
Compliance is a flowing river. So meta of you. I like that, man. That's pretty dope. I feel
I'll
like,
send you
like
one.
I just feel like dropping off the call and reflecting on that for 24 hours. But I like
who wants one. Anyone who wants one can message me. I'll send you one.
I definitely need one for my mental well-being at this point, because it's pretty cool. But so let me say something and respond to your response to the question. There are some aha moments, though. I think he called it, or Daniel called it, light bulb moment. You know what? Unfortunately, historically, they've been really bad moments, like data breaches or investigations or fines. Those have been the historic aha moments where companies are like, oh, wow, this is real. Now, I'm talking a few years back. I think your point about like the entrenchment of privacy through the like continuous blocking and tackling and pounding of it, both like philosophically and procedurally in the company is important. The other way to learn is to bang yourself against a wall, and that wall being a data breach or a DPA or your customers, making a big stink, which unfortunately has been a big trigger for a lot of investment over the last 5-6 years.
Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the truth of the matter is that, it's both things. It's both the energizing, building it in, extreme method, but the reality is when the dam breaks and something goes wrong, that is absolutely does get people's attention. And it can be within your company, or it can be a competitor, or even a much bigger company like, Facebook obviously sets the tone quite a bit for privacy. And, to be honest, gives a bad rep to other people, other smaller companies, because of the breaches that have occurred in Facebook, and the laws that have been passed in the wake of the Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal is probably the best known one, but I think it's often some of the least factually understood, at least if you look at the way the laws are written in the wake of it. So I think that, I'm sure it's really interesting for you, Pedro, to have to deal with the PR element of how you're going to position yourself as a privacy conscientious company, and knowing that you're a leader in that, just by nature of your size and your business. But in terms of aha moments, I would definitely say it's equal parts, if not a little bit larger part, the negative things that happen that make you make your company kind of sit up and pay attention and put more attention into the fact that every element of the business needs to be working together on some of these issues.
So speaking of the negative elements, let's talk a little bit about dark patterns, because we're here to talk about that a little bit too. And I wanted to kick off with privacy by design, because it's one of the ways in which we think about and put ourselves in the shoes of the user or the consumer, and therefore consider what could be a pattern, a dark pattern or not. So like maybe starting with you, Pedro, like there's a good question here about which ones caught your eye. Like what caught your eye and sort of not necessarily in marketing or advertising, what caught your eye just generally or had the feel, of something like a dark pattern to you?
I want to answer your question, but I want to say something about dark patterns before I get into it.
Sure.
Here's one of the big problems this is me speaking for myself, not for Facebook. Here's one of the big problems I have with the concept of dark patterns in the context of privacy regulation, privacy enforcement. How we're defining dark patterns and how we decide what is and what isn't a dark pattern, I do not think is a privacy expert decision. Privacy people are not experts at understanding human behavior or interpreting, for example, like I'm a privacy person, right? I'm not the right person to decide what coercion means, okay? And like we gotta leave that to people who are, psychologists, sociologists, whatever. I don't even know who the experts are. So one of the challenges I see is that there's a lot of privacy talk about dark patterns, but not a lot of deference to the communities and experts who can determine what is and what isn't a dark pattern, and what coercion is, and what illusion is, and what punishment means, and what interference means, and some of the typical dark pattern scenarios that we know. Like, for example, nagging is a dark pattern. You ask which one catches my attention. Nagging, right? So I make a decision as the user in my privacy interest, but it's not in the business interest of the company that I'm interfacing with, and that company constantly nags me to get me to change my mind, right? Like that's a dark pattern. Like if every time I log in, there's 75 windows telling me are you sure about the decision? Do you want to change your mind? We really need you to change your mind. We might charge you a fee for this later. All of these other things. And it's persistent, that's a nag, and that's annoying, and that is potentially a dark pattern. But how much nagging is a dark pattern? Is that a privacy expert's decision to make? Am I qualified to decide how much nagging? Is it zero nagging? Is showing the prompt once a year a nag? Is it showing it once a week? Is it showing it once a day? Is it showing it once an hour? See, once an hour is pretty easy, right? I feel like that's annoying. But once a year, am I nagging you by just refreshing your preferences once a year? I don't know the answer, right? And I don't think privacy experts are the ones to make those decisions. I think we got to leave those up to people who understand human behavior in the ways that dark patterns manipulates humans. And I'm not sure I'm qualified to do that. So I think the first thing we need to do is come up with some well-established definitions of what dark patterns are and how they affect people negatively, and creating objective criteria around that's going to be really hard, Andy. I mean, different companies can come up with their own constructs, but those constructs are going to be in light of their businesses, right? NGOs can come up with their own too, but those are going to be in the context of their geography or their constituency, right? Governments can do it too, but that's also going to have a socio-political component to it. So who's the best, who do we defer to make these decisions? Is it scientists? Is it social scientists? Is it mental health professionals? I don't know. But we have to think hard about this before we jump into regulation, in my opinion. And again, I said it at the beginning, but I'm going to say it one more time. I'm talking on my own behalf here. This is not Facebook, but it's my opinion. I think we could unpack a bag of worms here, or open a can of worms here that is not the one we intend to, if we overreach as privacy people into areas where we're not qualified to do so.
Yeah. I struggle a little bit with like reconciling what you just said versus things that have a feel to me as a consumer dark. And so like an example would be, which I've discussed with both of you before, so it won't be new to you, but is in the context of submitting a health claim for health insurance, so many health insurance companies require that you fax that receipt over to get your claim, processed, and to get it, put against your deductible if you have one. Like that feels, in 2021, that feels oppressive and purposeful, where we have the ability, and these companies have massive portals that you log into for all sorts of other services, to not allow you to submit a claim virtually through email or attaching a receipt or something and making you fax something. Like I get what you're saying, and I totally agree. Like it's a person who's not me to decide the answer to that question.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I struggle because I hate that, and that feels horrible too.
Yeah, and so the question is a dark pattern subjective? Do people have different preferences? Can I handle a level of nagging that you can't? Like, these are real questions we have to answer and investigate. We shouldn't be hasty. And one of the other things I'll mention, and I really want to hear from Sarah about this too, so I'll be quiet, but like some of the loudest critics and folks speaking the most about like the need for regulation and like, Silicon Valley's like, I don't know, like rogueness on dark patterns and manipulative practices work for publications that are impossible to unsubscribe from. Okay. So like the irony of editorial in a publication that if I subscribe to, I have to send an email, call, fax, speak to somebody in person, change my credit card number, close my bank account, and essentially like, go through 57,000 loophole hurdles to unsubscribe from is not lost on me. So dark patterns, the point I'm making is that dark patterns is not new. We all had a Columbia House subscription 15 years ago that you got 15 free CDs and then you were locked into a nightmare for 2 years. And I didn't see a lot of laws proliferate around that, right? And so like we're just in a different era of it where it's more intrusive and more in your face, and a lot closer aligned to like your own mental well-being and your economics. And I get that we are in a more quote unquote severe environment for the consequences of dark patterns, but like it's not a new issue, and it's not lost on me that some of the folks speaking really loudly about the need for laws and rules and changes are perpetuating dark patterns in their own organizations, or working for organizations that perpetuate dark patterns. Sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
No, that's all right. I think that the interesting area of dark patterns now is that when we talk about the faxing incident or the unsubscribe, these are the legacy ones, and some of the murkier area that's really harder for our to decide. It's like you said, how often can you nag when you're crossing the line? If you take Apple's new example from iOS 14.5, if it says allow this app to track, or do you need to have a Facebook message that first tells you, wait a minute, this is how we monetize our content, and gives you more context? Are both of those companies trying to like tip the scale and manipulate your emotional response to a short message, a long message, what kind of information they're putting in front of you to encourage you to allow their business to work? So I think we're entering a phase of dark patterns where it's just become, like you said, it's much more murky and more complicated, because it's not simply a matter of like, okay, we're going to, in the 21st century, in 2021, we're going to make you try to locate a fax machine. But it's like, well, if the button says that when I follow this, that now I'll get 10 followers, or whatever the promise is being made, to the user that to help encourage towards a destination that you want the consumer to land on, or the direction you want them to flow. And that's, I mean, if we're all real about how products work, all products are trying to encourage you to, you know, buy them, keep them, renew them, all those things. And so at what point are you engaging in an unfair practice that manipulates or, you know, just completely takes the advantage of the consumer's, you know, time and attention, and unfairly is deceptive in the way it gets you to agree to a certain outcome.
Yeah, and let me say one more thing. Like, all dark patterns, or the taxonomy of dark patterns, all the components are not created equal, right? And I think that's important to think about. Like, there are some dark patterns that on their face objectively are bad. If I'm lying, if I'm telling you a lie to get you to make a choice that I want, that's not right. I don't think there's a subjective criteria where you're going to say, you misled me into a decision, I got bamboozled, and that's okay. Like, that's, to me, a clear problematic pattern that shouldn't be allowed, right? Another one is like, you know, hiding information. So not telling the full truth about something. That's not necessarily lying, but it's also misleading, right? And so, like, saying to someone, your data is not going to be used for X, but then it is used for like X.1, but, you know, that's problematic. And I think objectively, like, you don't have to be a, you know, ethicist to figure out that that's difficult. But like
let's pause on that example for a second, because this uses of data in today's world, which can be incredible. It's also really hard for consumers. You know, you go to the website to read the article or buy the shoes. You're not there to learn about their data collection practices, right? And so if they're trying to make it easy for you to understand and you say X and not X.1, there could be a nefarious reason why you're doing it, or it could be, gosh, would a end user, like an average person, like understand the difference between this use and that use, or these types of disclosures? Or is a wall of text going to be something that someone just says unilaterally no or yes to? Whereas you give them less choices, less granular choices, but general idea behind it, so that you're helping them make more informed decisions. So I hear your point, but I just want to pause on that for a minute, because I think that's exactly the balance that a lot of us are looking at right now, which is you don't want your product to be deceptive, but you also want someone to read it, and you don't want to be accused of giving like a boilerplate thing that doesn't resonate with an end user.
Well, let me respond to that though, because I think this, sorry, Andy, because I think this is important, and I'd like to also like kind of put a bow on my point about all dark patterns aren't equal. So to go back to the nagging example, like, when does prompting become nagging? I don't know, and I don't think I'm qualified to decide that. And I actually, if I had to take a guess, I'd say it's probably contextual and situational, and the answer is it depends. I don't think there's like an objective criteria for when you're being nagged. I think it depends on the people involved, the organizations, the decision being made, etc. With all that said though, like, to the point of all dark patterns aren't created equal, another favorite one of mine that comes up all the time is like visual interference, right? Like, you make it hard visually to like interact with content until a desired decision is made, right? And that one, it gets talked about a lot. But the challenge I see is this: what is a cookie banner? Is that a visual interference? You tell me. What is the Apple iOS 14 prompt? Is that a visual interference? Because it clearly is. You cannot act until you've interacted with that interference. And it will continue showing up until you just make a decision, right? And so not only is that nagging, it's interference, but it's driving a policy outcome that privacy advocates and privacy people want. And so is it only a dark pattern if you're doing the reverse, is trying to get someone to make a non-privacy ideal decision? These are important questions that we're going to have to deal with, because I see a lot of visual interference that is driving like regulatory driven privacy outcomes, meaning like more privacy protective conclusions. And there's a lot of nagging and a lot of interference that happens. And so like, you can't have it both ways. It is either a dark pattern or it is not. And if the issue is giving people informed choices so they can make the best decisions, information, particularly truth telling, cannot be a dark pattern in and of itself. So suggesting to someone that like, you made this privacy decision, if you make a different decision that is less privacy protective, you may get these additional benefits, or you may, you'll help us run our business, or you'll whatever, we'll create ads or whatever it is. we have to be careful about being absolutist and saying that's automatically a dark pattern if you're trying to get someone to make a decision that is less privacy protective. And again, I mean, I'm saying this over and over, but these are just my opinions. But I think it's worth thinking about because, like, you know, at some point this becomes like a little capricious if we're not careful.
Well, and I think that it's interesting where we keep coming back to this privacy space where I think we're in the existing digital environment, it's unrealistic to think that we could continue to rely on consent and choice. We actually have to figure out some engineering solutions to that. And I think that that's some of the work that's happening now because you know, you do get consent fatigue. You don't want to, you either just make you can't decide every time you go to a new site, you know, you're going to read their entire data collection practices or not. You're going to either just say yes or no. Or you're just going to make a decision on the type of app you're downloading. Do I want this app to track me? I don't know. Do I want to get an ad from them? Do I like them? Do I want this app to survive? I mean, I don't really know what's going to be going through the minds of some people, but I think that I don't think that consent has been a good solution, and it shows itself increasingly to be a poor solution. That doesn't mean that it has to exist in certain circumstances where you have an actual relationship with the company with whom you're purchasing things, then, you know, you do move into that. But when we're talking about like our browsing behavior and our general digital life, I think that what we need to do is figure out how we can have some engineering layered things that have these built-in protections that don't maybe have to rely so heavily on the personal data or being drawn to you.
How can we realistically, I mean, we've raised a lot of interesting points here. We don't have regulation. We don't have a clear definition of what a dark pattern is. It exists in some sort of space where you have to, and where are we the right people to analyze it? So I guess my question is, how then do we do product counseling for companies like ours? You know, we're often in the room, luckily, and I think that's the reason we like our jobs, right? Like we're the privacy person, the product person, the trust and safety team, which was mentioned in the Q&A. We're often in the same room discussing features or discussing functionality. How do we then, given the instability or lack of clarity around some of the things that we're talking about now, how do we advise the business? How do you advise them on okay, well, what data set are you using for this particular thing and this particular feature? And, you know, we don't have as much background data to develop opinions about things on, whereas, you know, with another feature or functionality, we might be able to say, no, like you need consent for that activity, or you shouldn't use data this way. It's a lot easier to say that. In these situations, I feel like how do we do that? You know, I have an opinion too, but how do we then, you know, make good judgments for the business?
Well, let me say something because I'm watching the questions, right? And one of those, somebody mentioned that the nature of selling is manipulative, right? And see, this is where I think we can get into trouble really fast because that's not true, okay? It's persuasion, like, and a good salesperson is not manipulative at all. And I've worked for some of the best sales-oriented companies that ever existed, okay? You know, Salesforce, where I used to work, has a lot of policies against manipulating, right? Manipulating suggests that there's like a coercive component there, that there's a misrepresentation component there, that there's, you know, an influencing that is creating an inability to make an independent choice. That's not that, you know, that's not what good selling is about. Okay, like when I go buy a car, I'm not getting manipulated into an upgrade. They're persuading me. They're telling me, hey, like, what's your budget? Like, if you spend an extra $500, you get these 10 other things, right? Like, that's not manipulating me. Okay, that's persuading me. Now, there is a fine line between persuasion and manipulation. I don't think it's privacy people who have the expertise to decide that. And this is why I worry when I hear talk like this amongst privacy people. It concerns me because I used to work in a real business where manipulation and persuasion really do matter, right? Like, you know, in like the context of like political kinetics, if you understand what I mean, right? And so, like, that's not what we're talking about here. And so asking a user of yours or a customer of yours to revisit a decision and you trying to persuade them to make a different decision than they originally did, or to make a decision in the first place that you think is more desirable for you and them in ways that may be a tension with privacy, I don't think automatically rises to the level of deceptive or manipulative. And we need to be really careful about this, because what happens, I think, is we can get into a patriarchal setting where we're telling everyone, it doesn't matter how you feel or what your interaction felt like, you're getting manipulated. And that's not always true. People are smarter than that. We act like consumers are idiots. What definitely cannot be allowed is lying, hiding the ball, misleading, roach motels. These types of dark patterns are inherently bad, because I can't make a decision if I don't know all of the information, or if I'm working off of lies, or if I'm working off of like trap patterns. But if I'm being told facts and I'm being told in a way that's persuasive, what's so bad about that? I don't understand. Like, we persuade our kids to eat their vegetables by like promising them dessert or an allowance or whatever. Like, persuasion's not bad. Or am I lost? Am I just old school and I'm lost in thought?
I think you end up in a situation though where the privacy policy has to do a lot of the heavy lifting and has to explain things, and like therein lies a challenge of trying to rely on that, right? Your privacy policy, the best one in the world, is still difficult to read, and still difficult to get through. And so, I don't know if the question, in the chat was about more broadly selling as a concept, or selling data as defined by the CCPA, CPRA, because that definition is a mile wide. And so I don't know if that was what they're getting at, and maybe the data sale.
Yeah, but here's the thing, Andy. Like
CCPA, I don't know the answer to that.
But CCPA and CPRA teach us something, that words matter, and that CCPA and CPRA are an example of or word choice. Okay, like we have to figure out how to comply with it, but nobody's looking at that saying, wow, that comes from the Ernest Hemingway and Mark Twain school of simplicity and clarity, right? Like, it is a difficult to understand rule that's going to keep us employed forever, but going to drive companies nuts forever. And we'll have to decide whether consumers are better off for it or not after we have enough data and enough time has passed to see if it adds value, right? But with all that said, if words matter, then the words we use have to matter. And so we have to be really careful how we think about this because even the term dark pattern suggests negativity, right? And I've given examples of, like, for example, nagging, where there could be lots of times where nagging is good, right? Like, for example, let me just give you an example. Let's say my fire alarm was connected to Wi-Fi, which I know they have those now, like Nest makes one and whoever. And so, like, let's say Google realizes that the battery is dead, and every 5 minutes, they send me a prompt on my phone and say, your carbon monoxide monitor and your fire alarm are not working. You need to change the battery. No one is mad at that. I wouldn't be mad at that. I'd be annoyed as shit until I fix it, but I'm not mad, right? And so I think the problem in our industry is that we're deciding that if you want to be persuasive about something that is not in your absolute most privacy interest, that's automatically bad. And then my suggestion is, we have to let people decide what's in their interest. We have to give them choices. And we have to allow experts who understand the power of persuasion versus manipulation versus sale versus coercion to tell us where those lines are, so that we as privacy professionals can, as Sarah mentioned, create technologies, processes, and features that operate within those frameworks. But I just don't think it's privacy people who decide this.
Do you guys think we need regulation?
I have to be honest, I haven't been impressed to date on the regulations that we've had that deal with privacy. And I think there's a huge knowledge gap between regulators understanding the digital world that we live in, and just, real basics about how technology works and how the internet works. And I think that until that gap is closed, I wouldn't feel very confident. We have the consent model that was most popular in Europe and got a lot more steam with GDPR in some ways. It's just, I don't think it's realistic as we continue on the pace that we are at in the use of devices, apps, information, that people can, stop and make a GDPR level informed consent on data collection practices when they look at their phone 200 times a day and might go to 100 different sites. I just don't.
But if the FTC took action, right? I know they're focused on this issue, right? So the FTC took action under its power, and came up with uh, evidence and developed against a company that showed deception or something, wouldn't we then at least have something to hang our hats on, right? A starting point to look at a factual scenario. Like, I'm not aware of that.
Well, I mean, not to pick on Pedro or Facebook, but we had a really well explored scandal in Cambridge Analytica that CCPA was ostensibly passed in the wake of to correct, and it was a law that really did favor Facebook and other walled gardens and didn't favor a lot of smaller companies. So I think that's a clear example of, like, I mean, the FTC, also had fining power and activity in that realm as well, and we haven't seen it yet. It doesn't mean that they couldn't pick, do a study and go after who they think would have the most influence on, the industry to change specific practices. But I do think that,
I don't view that. I don't view that violation or that FTC action as in my mind at least, as calling to mind dark patterns. I view that as, I mean, maybe a different scenario. Obviously, that's a big fine against big company, but so, like, I guess what I'm thinking is, do we need some sort of FTC action specifically related to, like, deception? Not to pick on an ISP, but like an ISP, for example, like making my ability to find the terms and conditions associated with my cable bill like absolutely impossible, or making my ability to making customer service really difficult, or closing an account, something we all have familiarity with that. Like, so I guess I'm sort of wondering, we need that kind of activity, because I put Facebook in a separate box. I put the Cambridge thing in a separate box. I put other things that have happened against big companies and big platforms, like, so far at least feel to me like in a separate box, and I don't have enough to go on with respect to, like, my own activities in terms of advising a product team, on a dark pattern, other than my gut instinct on what doesn't feel right to a consumer. Like, if I step into the consumer's shoes, or the user, if I'm, B2B, or I'm talking about, B2B to C, like, what is the expectation of that person? And you're right, Pedro, like, we're not qualified to do that, but we have to do it in some respects.
Yeah, and I think people have lots of knee-jerk gut reactions. I have them too, right? Which is like, well, this just doesn't pass the ear and eye test. But the ear and eye test is not a way to determine, like, what is manipulative or not, right? Like, or what is coercive or not, or what is, um, um, when does something become an ag or not, and when is an ag okay? And what is the desired behavior where there's more leeway versus an undesirable behavior, and who decides what those are? Like, these are all really difficult questions. Now, to your point about regulation, like, the FTC Act literally says unfair and deceptive. Okay, like, that's exactly what it says. And so, like, unfair and deceptive practices need to be evaluated, and consumers need to be protected. And I don't know that we need additional laws for that. Maybe the FTC just needs more resources. Look, I'm relatively new at Facebook. I know Facebook and Google and Amazon and a couple others are like the punchline of every, like, abusive data practice joke, and everyone pokes at them, and I get why, and it all makes sense. With that being said, like, we need to be more constructive about how we have these discussions, right? Because social media comes with a lot of challenges, and it can be nightmarish, as we saw during some election cycles, and as we see in different parts of the world where misinformation and a lot of negative things are happening on these platforms. But we cannot lose sight, and this is my personal opinion and why I joined Facebook and came to work here. We cannot lose sight of the important value that these services provide us. I live alone in Atlanta, and my family is nowhere near me. The mental trauma of COVID-19 on me would have been 50x if I didn't have the ability to WhatsApp my family, go on Facebook and check in with my friends, and use Instagram, and go on YouTube and watch literally every video about, like, van life, over the course of 6 months. I could. These things enrich our lives. And so, instead of, like, approaching everything as, let's ban everything, let's block everything, let's not allow these companies to thrive, I think what we need to do is have constructive dialogue, where, like, regulatory action is the final step, but the initial steps are, discussions and work groups and collaborative efforts to make things better. And one of the ways that we need to shift and do that more is to include users in the discussion. Because if you ask someone, do you want Amazon not to have access to any of your data? Most people, and the studies are out there, are going to say, no, I want to turn everything off. But people's behaviors don't reflect their sentiments. People love to be catered to. I think the CEO of Shopify tweeted about this last week. Like, people love curated content. People love curated experiences. And so we know that's true. And so the idea that we could just top personalization is not aligned with what the signal by people's interactions online is sending us, right? And I don't mean us as in Facebook. I mean us as in privacy professionals. I mean us as in the world. And so we need to strike a balance, is my personal point of view, between this idea of like absolutism. Dark patterns are dangerous. Just turn them all off. Well, I gave an example just now of a quote unquote dark pattern that isn't very dark, right? Like if my insulin pump is, well, let me give you a better one. If my Apple Watch tells me once an hour to stand up and breathe, why am I not annoyed at that? Because it's a kind of a cool thing, right? And like, is it a dark pattern? You tell me.
We got to wrap. We could talk about this for another 4 hours. I have a feeling Pedro has 40 million other additional examples of of questionable dark patterns. So we're Alice is hosting a breakfast tomorrow morning, I think at 9:30. So anyone who wants to join, we're willing to keep going into it and dive into it more if anyone wants to. But so thanks to
what you
Wiley
should do,
for
Andy,
having
to
us.
get maximum attendance for that is like fill everyone's inboxes with lots of spam and
Doing
like
it.
lots of disruptive images and emojis.
Yeah, I'll just go find the technology to do that. I don't have it on hand, but thanks, Judy.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
friends.
This concludes the Dark Patterns and Privacy by Design panel. Thank you so much, Andy, Sarah, and Pedro, and also Keanu for your participation. And thanks to all of you for joining us, and especially for the participation. We realize that there are a lot of questions and comments that didn't get answered, so we'll work with the panelists to get responses back. We'll see you at the next spoke session, which is on vaccine passports at 3 p.m. Eastern. You can join from the attendee portal page. Thank you very much.